connect to the meter, either because it's unmetered, it's lost or leaked or something. And the electricity system consumes a lot of energy. About half of that or more is lost as waste heat out the smokestack. So if cars are even worse, like 80% is lost as waste heat out of our tailpipes. There's a lot of waste in the system, and that's a great place to start. One way to reduce the waste is make our system smarter with better metering. Traditional meters, really, by traditional I mean now a decade plus old, they didn't give us much information. Better meters give us more information about what we're using, who's using it, why, for how long, which appliance, and do we need to do it then. Is it indoor, outdoor, heated, unheated, treated, untreated, that kind of thing. And we can spend money on metering and data, and that would save us money. In fact, so much so that data is now the world's most valuable resource. It's now what oil was the last century. Instead of drilling for oil, you drill for data. It's a resource that you can extract. Now, oil is not useful until you upgrade and refine it. Same thing with data. The data is useful, but you have to upgrade, refine it, and put it to purpose before it really liberates you. And that has led to a remaking of the market. 7 of the top 10 publicly listed companies in terms of market capitalization are data companies. Apple at the top. You have to get to ExxonMobil, number 7, for a publicly listed energy company. You go back 20 years, well, you go back 10 years, and it would have been 7 of the top 10 were public energy companies. So the world's changing from energy to data, but they're coupled. We use data for energy and vice versa. I think going to a smart infrastructure is a way to save a lot of money. If we look at the water and wastewater systems, we need $1 to $2 trillion in 1 or 2 decades. We need $1 or $2 trillion for the power sector in the next 1 or 2 decades. That's $2 to $4 trillion in the next 1 or 2 decades. That's a lot of money. Apparently, as a nation, we're not in the mood to spend a lot of money. We'd rather do other things, and so we can use data and Internet of Things and smarter systems to extend the life of the existing infrastructure and to delay when we have to start spending some of that money and extend the duration over which we spend it. So maybe it becomes $2 to $4 trillion over 3 to 5 decades instead of 1 to 2 decades. That becomes much more manageable. And by the way, along the way, there's some good market opportunities making money with smart water management or Internet of Things in cities and that kind of thing. So there's big money to be made while saving money for other people, improving the reliability and resilience of the system. So there's a lot of energy, water, a lot of water energy, a lot of problems, a lot of solutions. I think one of the main solutions we should approach is by ramping up in education. We've got a good partnership with Itron that was mentioned earlier by Jason. We developed an app called Resourcefulness. This is based on a book I wrote called Thirst for Power, Energy, Water, Human Survival. We turned that into an interactive curriculum or app called Resourcefulness for K through 12. Really more like for middle school and first couple years of high school, so maybe it's not K through 5, but it's useful for students. It's already been used by thousands of students. In particular, it's popular in Japan, which I think is sort of interesting. So a lot of Japanese students have downloaded it. And work with Cisco Learning Media, interactive company I'm affiliated with, to make it an Itron and help distribute it around the world for free, which I think is great. In fact, yesterday we went to Francis Parker Schools, you heard, to talk about it there. I am talking to some very smart, engaged students. And I understand it's like Kevin Blakely and Congressman Peters, a couple people here have kids who either go or have gone there. So it's great to meet them, and that's part of what we do is try to take STEM education to them. Along the way, I would suggest that STEM education needs to evolve to STEAM education because the earth without art is just, So it can't be just technical, it has to be beautiful and visual as well. That's the way people learn, that's the way they think. So I think education is a big opportunity, and these kind of forums are a step in that direction. And then lastly, I'll close by saying I think we should wrap up on conservation. The conservation is one of those solutions that works. And I captured this quote here from Ban Ki-moon. I think he says it in a way that's really great. Use energy and water sparingly. Even a single drop of water is precious. Even a single drop of water is precious. So boy, is he correct. I think that's right. And what I like about conservation is that it works at many scales. It works at the small scale of the human. I, as an individual, can affect my resource consumption by turning things off as I leave the room. And so at the scale of me, at the scale of immediately, and so on a small time scale, small spatial scale, I can have conservation benefits. At the medium scale, say every decade or so, I could buy a more efficient appliance or a more efficient car. I could change my habits with what kind of materials I use. And then at a large scale, we can design our cities or regions so that they're more efficient and compact, and that will last sort of decades or centuries. So we can start implementing conservation this minute at the scale of a human, and we can implement conservation at the scale of continents for centuries. And it's one of the only solutions that works at every time in spatial scale, and that's why I like it. And I'll close with this one last comment to illustrate the power of conservation. This is an anecdote from me brushing my teeth with my daughter Evelyn. This was 11 years ago, almost to the day. And we used to brush our teeth together. Now she's a teenager, so she doesn't want to talk to me. But very parents with advice, I'd love to talk to you. So we used to brush our teeth together every night, and we would get our toothbrush wet to turn the water off to brush our teeth. We turned the water off while brushing because that would save a gallon or 2 of water, and you should do that as well if you want to save water. If you really want to save water, don't water your lawn, but you should also turn the water off while you brush your teeth. And I didn't turn the water off fast enough once to her liking, so she turned off the water and made a fist and glared at me. Said, "Turn off the water, Daddy. The scientists need time." This is a little dramatic 7-year-old. I'm like, "Holy cow." I think she really nailed it. I think this really captures the moment. There are a couple things. One is kids get the answer, and then we beat it out of them in high school and college. So we got to let them stick with the right answer, let them carry that through in life. And the other part is she's not saying conservation is the answer or the only answer, it's one of the answers. It's hard to light a light bulb with conservation, it's hard to drive to work with conservation, but conservation buys us a lot of time, and then we can develop other solutions, and I like that. And those solutions probably include the things we're going to talk about in this panel next. Thank you very much for your attention. It's a pleasure to be here, and I appreciate it.
So to the panelists, I don't know how you follow that. So you better start thinking about it as I introduce you up here. Dr. Weber, thank you. I'll say I've seen that presentation, I think, one other time. And I'm still fascinated by the data that you present as part of that, and your ability to talk that fast in a decent amount of time. So thanks for that. So now let me introduce our panel and bring them up to the chairs here, if you will. Again, really excited about those that we've gathered today to follow on Dr. Weber's presentation and have a conversation around the EnergyWater Nexus. So again, I'm not going to read bios, but I'll first introduce Jeffrey Keitlinger, the General Manager of the Metropolitan Water District of Southern California. Come on up, Jeffrey. I'll just take that first seat there, if you will. Again, you have Jeffrey's bio, but I'll just say, and I know that he'll touch on this as well, that the Met is the largest municipal water provider in the nation, delivering an average of 2 billion gallons of water a day to 19 million customers across Southern California. So, a big deal. Next, let me invite Scott Kreider up. Scott is the Vice President of Customer Services for SDG&E. If you look at what Scott does on a day-to-day basis, I think it's kind of impressive. He oversees customer-related activities for SDG&E, including customer contact centers, customer programs, smart meter operations, revenue cycle activities, privacy, electric rates, field services, and customer communications. Do you work with anyone, or you just kind of run the show yourself?
I just kind of make it up.
Good job. Next, I'll bring up David Graham. David is the Deputy COO of the City of San Diego. I'm not going to read his title because we'd be here till 11. But I like to say that David is in charge of getting shit done at the City of San Diego. And really, when we think about kind of where the city has gone from a smart cities perspective, from a renewable energy perspective, from a climate action plan perspective, that's really because of David's leadership and his team that sits behind him to really advance these efforts on behalf of the City of San Diego. So David, thank you for being here today. Now let me bring up Bill Mezzi, Itron, President and CEO of Itron. Had an interesting dinner last night with a couple of the folks that are on the panel and some of you in the room. And it's always interesting from my perspective to meet people like Philip, who are really visionaries and leaders in this space and are really trying to drive towards the digitalization of the utility space. You'll hear from Philip today, and you'll learn and understand his passion about energy and water management, reducing waste and building resourceful communities, and really what Itron is doing around the globe. Philip also recently testified in front of the U.S. Committee on Energy and Natural Resources about how smart technologies can help utilities address some of their critical challenges. So Philip will talk a little bit about that today as well. So thank you for being here, Philip. And finally, stepping in for TJ Costello, who we had billed as part of this, is Robert Hubbard. Robert's a San Diego native, former Marine, who has been in the IoT space for quite some time and is working throughout this country with a number of different cities and communities on their IoT and smart cities deployments. So happy to have him join us here today. So Robert, thank you. And Michael, I'm going to invite you up to sit on the panel as well, just to provide some insight as well. So what we're going to do, what I've asked the panelists to do, is just kind of give some brief remarks on kind of how they're thinking about this topic, maybe some things that they're working on, and as opposed to me just sitting there and asking them some planted questions, we really want to make this an interactive dialogue, not only between our panelists, but also between you and the audience. So we'll be taking questions as we go along. So Jeffrey, I'm going to start with you since we're here to talk about the Water Energy Nexus. We should probably start with the conversation for the Metropolitan Water District about water. So I will start with you, and I'll pull up your first slide there.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Jason, and appreciate the chance to be here with Clean Tech. So my focus on the EnergyWater Nexus is on the water side of the equation, but as Dr. Weber pointed out, they're incredibly interlinked, and so that helps.
Much better. The fourth largest bill that Metropolitan pays is our electric bill. And our #1 bill is the capital for the state water project. That's about $500 million a year. Our second largest bill is debt service for all the capital we built. Our third largest bill is labor. And then our fourth largest bill is our electrical bill, which runs in the closer to $300 million a year, but it depends on how much water we move in a given year. So this little gray area in the southwest portion is our service area. Metropolitan serves water to 6 counties in Southern California. We call it the urban coastal plain. We're a wholesaler. The counties are Ventura, Los Angeles, Orange, Riverside, San Bernardino, and San Diego counties. Pretty amazing. It's about 1/20th of the landmass of California. We have 1 in every 2 Californians crammed in the spot. 19 million people. 1 out of every 2 Californians, or another way of looking at it, 1 every 16 Americans are living in this little area. California has the 6th largest economy in the world, and 60% of that economy is in this area, this region. So quite the powerhouse, and it has to get its water. It basically gets its water from 3 aqueducts and then a little bit of local water. About 35% of our water is local water that comes from rainfall. The rest of it's brought in. Original aqueduct, the city of Los Angeles, Mr. Mulholland brought that down in the turn of the century. Then Metropolitan built the Colorado River Aqueduct. We started moving that water in the 1930s. And then Metropolitan teamed up with Governor Pat Brown to build the State Water Project in the 1960s. At its time, each of those aqueducts at its time was the most expensive project ever built in the state. And so every time we do these, it obviously is a big deal. It's pretty expensive. These red dots represent where we basically pump first and last on the system. So water's heavy. If you go backpacking, a quart of water is a couple of pounds on your back, and you need several of those, so water's heavy. And so we have to lift it. And where do we lift it with? Power. And that's how we get the water into Southern California. We have, if you look here on our Colorado River Aqueduct, we have 5 lifts totaling 1,600 feet to move that water into Southern California. But gravity's your friend as much as we can. Romans found that out. Every major civilization found that out. As much as you can, use gravity to move your water. That's what aqueducts are for. Our last lift on the Colorado is basically outside of Coachella, Palm Springs. And then from there, we deliver water entirely by gravity through our entire system. We capture it in reservoirs in Riverside. Riverside is about 1,500 feet above sea level. And from there, we service all the way down to the Mexican border and all the way up through the city of Los Angeles from Riverside using that 1,500 feet. So our last lift is out of Palm Springs, and that's how we get water into Southern California. On the California Aqueduct, moving from Northern California, tougher. That we have to get over to the Tehachapi Mountains. So we start out at a pretty good altitude, getting water out of Lake Oroville and the Sierras. We're at 5,000 to 6,000 feet. But then you hit this area called the Delta. It's about 500,000 acres. It's about 40, 50 miles of entirely at sea level. So it's a real tough job. I was going to use some other words, but it was very tough to get that water across the Delta. So we have these massive pumps at the south end of the Delta, and we turn them on and drag that water at sea level all the way through the Delta. Then once we get it across the Delta, we can pretty much drop it by gravity down California till we hit the Tehachapi Mountains, and that's a huge lift. That is over 1,900 feet in one spot. When we built that project, it was the single largest point source of electricity in the state of California. At one point, it was 9% of all of California's electricity right there, one place, lifting that water across the Tehachapis. It's much less now, and it's not so much that we are more efficient. We have learned ways to turn up the pumps and refine them and make them more efficient, but primarily it's just because everything else has grown in the state. It's now shrunk to just a couple of percent of our state's electricity. Which, let's go next slide. So this kind of captures that EnergyWater Nexus. You see basically almost 20%, a little over 19% of all of California's electricity is used in water, the water sector. 30% of our natural gas is used in the water sector. But interestingly, when you look at words, 3% of that 19 is to move water to the urban sector, and that's across the entire state. Most of it in Southern California, a little bit in the Central Valley and other spots, but we're the ones that have to lift over mountain ranges. So we're using most of that 3% down here in Southern California. A little bit for wastewater treatment, agriculture, mostly wells to get water for agriculture. And then the big chunk of it is the urban end use. That's to run your dishwashers, that's to run your clothes washers, and that's to take warm showers. In the natural gas, the 30% of natural gas that's used in the water sector, 29.5 of it is used to heat the water to have warm showers and warm clothes. So the big chunk of power is at the end user, and that's where we really focus on in our EnergyWater Nexus. Conservation, it buys us time. It means we're not going to get another one of those big aqueducts. We realize that. So we have to make do with those 3 big aqueducts, and the rest we do by conservation. Put it in perspective, we do water in acre feet. 1.2 million acre feet is what we get from the Colorado River. About 1.5 million acre feet is what we get from the State Water Project. Conservation and recycling, right now in Southern California, it delivers about 1.3 million acre feet of water a year. That's our 3rd major aqueduct, conservation recycling. That's our future. All our growth will have to come through those more efficient use of our existing resources. We know we're not going to get more. It's about how to make what we have go further. And then with that, I'll end there and we'll do questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Jeffrey. And kind of to reference Dr. Weber's presentation, I would consider you the unicorn in the room. How's that?
Sure.
All right. Scott.
We've all been called much worse, Jason.
Yeah.
So I'll take unicorn anytime. So good morning again, Scott Cutter with SDG&E. And first of all, Jason, thank you very much into Clean Tech for organizing this. You know, the Energy Water Nexus probably doesn't get enough attention. And, you know, we talk a lot in kind of parallel about water issues and about energy issues. And so I think more conversations about how those two really intersect are really important, especially here in San Diego, because, you know, quite frankly, we are not just the proverbial end of the pipeline, but the literal end of the pipeline, both in the water system and the power system. And so we have to rely on a lot of imports. And, you know, both sides, both the water and the energy industry, we need to make sure that, you know, we're efficient, that we're finding ways to conserve, and finding ways to, at least on the energy side, that we're cleaner. And probably most importantly for California, and especially in the South, is resilient. And making sure that we've got the infrastructure that's in place that can withstand, whether it's climate change, it's earthquakes, it's fires, all these types of issues that we have to deal with on a day-to-day basis. It's really important that we have very resilient systems, because as Dr. Weber said, water and energy is essentially the cornerstones of society, especially when it comes to water down here in San Diego. So I really kind of think about it in the Energy Water Nexus in 3 ways. Is one, let's talk about energy production first and the role that water plays. So about 14,000 megawatts of hydroelectric production here in the state of California. At peak, that's about 15% of our production, depending on the water availability. So that has its huge pluses. One, it's a carbon-free resource. 2, it can be stored. 3, it can help as we start to transition into more wind and solar and other intermittent resources. It can help kind of smooth out those gaps when production isn't as strong as we want it to be. On the other hand, sometimes we have too much production now. So as we're starting to see, and we can talk a little bit about this during the Q&A, is especially during the spring times when you have very high hydro power production as the snow begins to melt, you're releasing water through the dams. We also have high solar and wind production at the same time, and also demand through the state is generally about at its lowest during that spring. So we have this growing challenge in the state of having overproduction of clean resources, and which is just, you know, if you would have thought 10 years ago that we would have had too much clean resources on the system, but that's where managing the hydroelectric and with the increasing use of renewables, that is a big energy nexus, energy water nexus that we have to continue to deal with from a management perspective. I'd say too, and it was really already touched on, but just in terms of energy consumption, and I'm glad actually our stats match. So in terms of the energy requirements for really kind of shipping and transporting water around the state. But you know, the thing that really struck me is the kind of the 30% of natural gas just to really kind of heat water, and we're actually seeing that here in San Diego as well. And so that is an issue that we have to manage. And you know, there's a lot of discussion of whether for water heating should there be switches to more electric water heating versus natural gas water heating. And you know, that's one other area that we want to make sure that we have the most efficient production of heat in order to be able to use water and treat water effectively here in San Diego. And then finally is, and this is kind of unique to San Diego right now, but water production. And so, as everyone here is aware, you know, San Diego is home to one of the most advanced and energy efficient desalination plants anywhere in the world, up in Carlsbad, the Poseidon facility. It generates about, produces about 50 million gallons of clean water annually. A year. I want to make sure I got that right. So I wrote it down to make sure, because I'm not a water expert. So a year. So that's quite a bit of water for San Diego. And as that plant was being produced, it is very energy intensive. And interestingly, it is our single largest customer in San Diego at a single site. So it's a very large energy. So we work very closely with Poseidon and the Water Authority and others to make sure that we're putting those energy efficiency measures in place as desal continues to potentially be a solution for the future. So in closing, you know, we really see at SDG&E our role in kind of two areas. One, it's education about conservation and partnership with the Water Authority. And we've had a 25-year wonderful relationship with the Water Authority down here to cross-promote products, energy efficiency products that both save water and save energy. And so we really see that as a crucial relationship in this EnergyWater Nexus going forward. And then finally, you know, probably our most important role that we play is, as given how energy intensive water is to make sure that our energy system is clean as it can be. Jason mentioned, we're at 43% renewables here in San Diego. On our way to 50%, and the state is not stopping there. So as we add more renewables to the system, we can move that water with fewer pollutants, fewer carbon impacts, and fewer climate impacts. So look forward to the discussion. Thanks again for the invitation.
Thanks, Scott. David, before you speak, I probably should make note that we were streaming via Facebook Live on this presentation. So that little thing sitting there on that tripod there is the camera and the speaker. Hi, Mom. Yeah. Say hi to you, whoever you need to say to. But David, turn it over to you.
All right, well, this is a fantastic panel, and I appreciate everybody being here. My big takeaway from Dr. Weber's presentation is that, like the Kinks, T-Rex, and UFO, he's big in Japan. San Diego's big in Japan too these days, and we're kind of trying to be big in the entire world as it relates to the smart communities, smart cities space. When you think about everything that's been discussed here and these projects that are decades old that didn't take into account really the EnergyWater Nexus because energy was cheap, right? It was not a part of the design and the planning of the State Water Project or the Colorado River Project per se, because energy was cheap. Water was the thing that needed to be brought to locations that didn't have water. That was the commodity that mattered. Now, as electricity rates continue to rise and the water needs are still there, these projects have to be thought of in a very different way. Or if you're doing a new project, which I'll talk about in a second, like Pure Water, you have to take into account that EnergyWater Nexus first and foremost, rather than just thinking about it as a water project. So, Scott talked a little bit about the Carlsbad desalination project, obviously extremely power intensive, even to the point that it's built at a power plant, right? I mean, when we think about these issues now with San Diego, saying we need to deal with a huge issue and problem that we have, which is the fact that we have the dubious distinction of being the last city in the entire country to have to get a waiver from the EPA for the treated wastewater we dump into the ocean. Yes, David, why would you tell us that you guys are very environmentally unfriendly? Well, I'll tell you, because we kept on having to get a waiver, and instead of spending $2 billion to upgrade that plant and continue to push that water into the ocean, but better treat it, we worked with the environmental community and many of our stakeholders to say, can we create a brand new source of water here using indirect potable reuse? And instead of the issues of just upgrading what we treat, let's actually pull that back and create a brand new water source. So the Pure Water program will create a third of our drinking water coming from wastewater through indirect potable reuse. What's indirect potable reuse? Many of you know, but basically we treat the water, we introduce it back into a reservoir, and then we treat the water back again and put it into our drinking water system. Now, it'd be a whole lot cheaper if we could go to direct potable reuse, where we just treat it all on site and don't have to ship it out to a reservoir, clean water into a reservoir, dirty water, to clean that water, to come back to your tap, okay? Thanks EPA for that one. But until federal rules end up changing with regards to indirect versus direct potable reuse, this is what we're left with. So the Pure Water program, phase 1 that we're in the middle of right now, will treat water at the North City plant and ship it to Miramar, 8 miles away, and then treat that water and introduce it back into the system. You're looking at, for phase 1, about 30 million gallons a day coming from that project. Phase 2, this keeps on phasing in and out, okay. Phase 2 of that, which will be completed by 2035, completing that third of our drinking water, will be about 53 million gallons per day, which is the exact same as the Carlsbad desal project. Now, obviously, $2 billion worth of infrastructure necessary to create an indirect potable reuse project is a lot of money, and it's also something that at the same time that we are designing and creating a water treatment system, how do we deal with the energy impacts of that as well? How do we build from the ground up the exact same resources that we will need to try to reduce the overall utilization of outside energy, so non-renewable energy, and how do we make the whole thing work? So, some of the things that we're in the middle of doing right now, number one, battery storage associated with it. Scott didn't mention the fact that obviously we have one of the largest battery storage projects in the entire country here that SDG&E did up in Escondido. So how can we do distributed battery storage projects associated with the Pure Water system? 2, pump storage projects. We're exploring the fact that when you are pumping water uphill and at what times and at what rates, when that comes back down, can you generate energy from that? So there's clearly a nexus there for pumping at off-peak times, super off-peak, so cheap energy times, to then produce energy when you're running that water back down the hill. So we're looking at those projects as well. And then finally, obviously, solar. If we're going to be investing all of this, where can we put those solar resources as well? Helping us do a few things. One, meet the city's 100% renewable goals under our climate action plan. 2, provide on-site and more distributed energy, which increases energy reliability in the case that there are issues with regards to blackouts or the grid going down. And finally, an overall cleaner creation and production of that energy. We think about the big idea that the region, 85% approximately of our water is imported. It comes from outside of the city. We're reliant on that, and if we go all the way back to the early 90s, we had a huge scare when Met's board thought about cutting our water supply by 50%, the imported water. And that's just scary. So anything that the city can do to increase our energy and water reliability, though it may be expensive initially for ratepayers, ultimately is going to benefit in the case of resiliency, in the cases of carbon reduction, in the cases of ultimately creating a sustainable system that we can rely upon and continue to reduce our reliance upon things that the city does not control, so imported water, energy that we end up using, etc. It's a more reliable, more sustainable, more resilient energy system, and I'm hoping to be able to take it to Japan and say this is how San Diego's awesome.
Thanks, David.
Jason, thanks for having us. So Itron is the world's largest supplier of electric, gas, and water meters, communications that go in them, and the software that's used to collect information from these devices. The company started out with a very humble mission of just helping utilities to collect basic electricity, gas, and water consumption information more accurately. Then we figured out that this is a trove of information about how utilities are, how effectively they're distributing electricity, gas, and water, and us as consumers, how and when we're using it, because it turns out that there wasn't a lot of information there. And that as we were digitizing these resources, we were putting networks over electricity, gas, and water systems, as we have at SDG&E, and actually San Diego Water is a customer of ours as well. There are tremendous opportunities to share communications infrastructure, and then that begs the question of taking the next step. What other devices could be put underneath these networks? What other information could be collected in order to improve outcomes? I'll go back to the very humble statement that says you can't manage what you don't measure. And so we're in the business of providing insight in ever finer detail about what's going on in the system. Because when we talk about conservation, it's a great concept, but how do you do it? Where do you do it most cost effectively, and what conservation programs are the most yielding the best results? You need really granular information about how that's happening. And so as we put out smarter systems, we're able to really understand where the problems are, identify the opportunities for conservation and efficiency improvements, and then be able to target those programs and measure the results that are generated from them. And that's important because, as Dr. Weber's presentation talked about, 10 to 40% of water is lost, 1% of gas, actually about somewhere 3 to 7% of electricity. There are huge opportunities for us to build more efficient distribution systems. And then when we share infrastructure across electricity, gas, and water, we can build more efficient measurement systems and gather data that allows us to further optimize the system. When we connect to smart buildings and smart thermostats, we have tremendous opportunities really to better control conservation programs. And then, David's just mentioned a number of challenges of renewable energy coming onto the grid. How do we better manage supply and demand using pump storage and these other opportunities we have as the energy supply begins to fluctuate more, as we decarbonize the energy supply? How do we make demand more resilient? How do we coordinate all of us as consumers of electricity, gas, and water to get the timing correct in the system is enabled through this kind of smart technology and these sorts of communication networks that we're deploying. The next step that we would take is that we've got to open this system up by using so-called open standards and an open ecosystem to allow many, many players, and the kind of innovation that takes place in San Diego, that we're encouraging people to get on the system and bring their best ideas. And that means tapping into the very large R&D budgets of a number of our partner companies and adhering to a set of standards and partnering with, as I'm about to pass the microphone over, to great partners like Cisco, who are really the largest networking company in the world, to make it possible to use the sort of distributed networks where we have concentrated to pull this data forward and then be able to integrate it with all kinds of other devices and then unleash great minds to go digging in that data in order to really understand not just the connection between energy and water, how it is that we improve efficiency programs, and how it is that we think differently about the improvements that we need to make in the system in order to decarbonize our generation system and get our water usage under control. Thanks.
Thanks everyone. Thanks Jason. So I'm Robert Hubbard. I represent Cisco. And it's, hearing all the experts talk about their specific domains is very interesting, right? And Cisco is, we're the largest networking company in the world, right? So we manufacture switching, routing, software, a whole bunch of stuff that half of you are probably using our stuff in your house. But as a Marine and as somebody who's involved in the environmental cause here locally in San Diego as a resident, it's interesting for me to sort of see the different interdependencies of infrastructure that we've invested in as a society, right? So if you look at what Cisco's involved in a given city, back in the .com days, we might have helped pull a whole bunch of fiber under the street, right? Some of that got utilized, some of it didn't. Some folks used it, other folks built a whole new network to do things, right? With all of that sort of, think about the things that we've all invested in from a societal perspective and what has been used or not been used, or what are the opportunities to maximize efficiencies. Cisco views, obviously, the IoT opportunity as a huge one because we get to connect everything, right? That's great. But we also have a lot of insight into assets that aren't being used correctly, or if there's multiple redundancies across the city. So, my group is specifically tied to IoT and smart cities because they're very locked together, right? If I'm going to go deploy sensors, then what network is already there, and how do I maximize an existing network across 4 or 5 domains, right? So just the physical piece becomes very interesting. So you might have seen Cisco announce recently that we have a $1 billion smart city fund, right? And you know that a lot of companies got to repatriate capital recently, right, with the tax breaks and whatnot. So Cisco effectively brought back about $90 billion in capital, right? So a lot of Cisco's mission, if you really look at sort of the high level of things that started all the way back with John Chambers as our CEO, he started a project called the Country Digitization Project. And that was a philanthropic effort to go to countries that didn't have technologies to get water or different types of things that they needed, and to create STEM opportunities and all those types of things, right? So Cisco's been very involved with this on many different levels, and you think, well, you're just an IT company, how are you affecting things? What's really happening out of all of this, right? You think about the .com, and I talked about physical infrastructure that was put in. I'll tell you, most of the cities that I go to, and I've been to probably 2 or 3 dozen cities in the last 2 years talking about their specific smart city projects, they would tell you that 2/3 of the fiber network that they put under the street is not being used right now, right? Or that it doesn't even work anymore. They didn't use it, they didn't turn it on, it just doesn't even work. So those are not opportunities that are lost. That just means you fix what's on both ends of that fiber optic connection and it's back up, right? But as we look to sort of evolution, bring an evolution to the way cities manage their assets, there's a lot of opportunities for efficiency, right? If I've got the water company and the gas and the electric and transportation and all the different domains inside of a city that can leverage one network, right? Well, that's a massive savings. Why do we have redundant networks all over the place, right? So just think about that. The next piece is the data that comes through that. So let's switch from the physical layer to the logical layer, right? You've heard about the folks that are experts in their specific silos today. But I will tell you that the projects that we get involved in that enable a lot of things, right? Open data sources that are out and available from the city here locally even. That allows grad students to go in and actually look for answers with data, right? And you talk, there's an earlier comment that gets overused a little bit in the IT industry, that data is the new oil, right? But it is very true. There's a definite interdependence of the way that we deliver or recycle water or repurpose whatever we're doing. Data has to help you do that, right? You can't just do that blindly. But, think about the open data sets that are being made available so that folks can actually access that. You can educate folks with that. I'm involved in a lot of hackathons here locally in San Diego. They're using open data sets from the city, right? Thank you, city, for allowing that. But again, how do we solve problems when you're just in one silo, right? I'll tell you a quick story about a project up in Lake Erie called the Internet of Water, right? Couldn't figure out why they were having algae blooms around certain areas of that area of the water, right? And so, nobody could figure it out. They put out a challenge, trying to hit the local colleges. Can anybody sort of dig into this? We'll put up basically most wanted. Whoever can figure this out, we'll give you a $10,000 prize. Well, it took about 8 different domains of data to solve that problem, right? It wasn't just the water. It wasn't just the water temperature. It wasn't just looking for certain elements in the water. It was looking at traffic. It was looking at weather. It was looking at time of day. It was looking at all kinds of different things, right? And those are the opportunities that really are enabled through information, right? Analytics, which when you think about the data economy, we talked about that earlier, that some companies strictly drive most of their revenue on data now. Facebook started that, right? Facebook did their valuation for their IPO. If you were stockholders, you probably remember, they said that they were going to basically drive their stock through advertising. And what they do is they sell data, right? Think about that opportunity for the public sector, right? This public sector is starting to pull all these data sets together. There's a lot of insights. There's a lot of opportunity from a commercial perspective to sell data for different things or to get intrinsic value out of data to create more efficiencies. That's a source of capital, right? So now you've got assets that are being used more efficiently. You've got data that's providing opportunities for students and other folks to actually come in and build businesses. So you marry capital with public-private higher ed and you have a bunch of innovation. It's just a very exciting time. And I think, people talk about this as sort of the new industrial revolution, that IoT and data and smart city is going to drive a lot of new things, and we're certainly seeing that. The last thing I'll close with, some of the interesting trends that some of you may or may not have heard of. In certain areas of the country or even globally, we're seeing models shift, right? Folks that used to sell energy are now talking to us about becoming owner-operators for different cities that they're not in today, right? So for example, you may have somebody that delivers energy right now in a certain part of the world, and they're saying, look, I want to go into the smart lighting business or the smart city business because solar's taking my revenue, right? Our revenue is flat to declining as an energy company, so I'm going to go and sell to 10 states smart lighting solutions. This is just your local, an SDG&E-like company that's going and doing those things. So models are going to shift, and the economics of everything that we are familiar with are definitely going to shift. So when I hear sort of this is the industrial revolution all over again, it really is a big opportunity, right? It's a great opportunity for all of us. It's a great opportunity to bring degree programs to colleges and to bring the next generation up thinking this way. So,
Thanks, Robert. And just so you know, that in San Diego, we like to say that data is the new bacon. Maybe it's the new beer. Maybe that's what data is the new beer.
No more branding.
Philip, I want to ask you a question really quick, and we touched on a little bit your testimony recently in front of the Senate committee. If you could talk a little bit about kind of the message that you delivered in DC, kind of from your perspective, I think that would be an interesting.
Sure, yeah, Jason forgot to mention that. So I was invited to testify in front of the Senate Energy Committee a couple weeks ago, and for a very specific timing. There's been quite a lot of discussion, as you know, at the national level about the possibility of up to $1.5 trillion investment or a fund in infrastructure. And at the national level, when infrastructure is discussed, it's normally thought of as roads, bridges, and airports, sort of hard assets. And the Energy Committee wanted to make the very strong point that said investments that are made in the infrastructure for delivering electricity, gas, and water are tremendously important for the economy of this country. And the thing that drives our 21st century economy and this hierarchy that Dr. Weber put up there are that we have clean, potable water when and where we need it, and that the power stays on, and that it's also safe, reliable, and affordable. So the investments that we need to make in order to have a competitive economy are seen in roads and potholes, but are sometimes unseen in the wires and pipes that we have. And so there needs to be a little bit more focus and discussion on those topics. And so that was the general tone of the hearing. Specifically, what I hope we were talking about were the great sorts of benefits that these investments have made at places like San Diego Gas and Electric, where we see very, very strong results and a more resilient grid that has been able to withstand significant hurricanes in the last season, deliver better service to customers, and really improve outcomes. And that this data can be used for helping to target how we invest in new infrastructure, how we sort of maximize the returns on the assets that we have in place, how we deal with an aging workforce, that it's possible to use this kind of smart technology and data to tackle very big problems in surgical and progressive ways that make the transformation much more palatable and affordable.
So I asked you that question for a reason, because Congressman Peters just joined us, and I'm going to ask him if he can to come down here and talk a little bit about his experience on this in the House side, and specifically on the Energy and Commerce Committee that he served on. Congressman, I did an excellent job earlier of introducing you and talking about everything great that you've been doing for us here in San Diego. So I won't repeat all that. We are on Facebook Live, so you can go back and watch it later, which I know you will. We all talked about how great you were, what great things you were doing in DC. So thanks for joining us here today, but definitely wanted to give you an opportunity to talk a little bit about what you're doing up in DC and some of the things that you're seeing.
Okay. Thanks very much. Thanks, Jason, for having me. I love coming back to this group. It's such an exciting, vibrant operation you got here going on in clean tech. And I think a couple of the themes I'd share with you is one is I've been asking people who come testify before the committee, what is the federal government's role? And I think fortunately for you, it's not a big role. A lot of the innovation that's happening here, a lot of the investment is happening through the private sector and through investor-owned utilities. But a couple things they did want to talk about was permitting, and they would like to see that permitting happens. And we often see localities holding up permits on facilities, even on renewables, and research. The federal government plays a role in basic research, the kind of research that a company that has to be concerned about quarterly profits can't really do. The federal government's always done a good job in that. So I'm emphasizing that those kinds of things in terms of research in terms of the budget. President Trump zeroed out a lot of the research for basic energy technologies like batteries and things like that. We want to make sure that we get that, we preserve that. The other thing I'm working on is this infrastructure idea. I think infrastructure does have to incorporate the resiliency and effectiveness of the grid. You know, we have to make sure that our systems, our critical infrastructure systems, are protected. And I think that will be a large emphasis to the extent that we spend public money. I'm skeptical about the ability of this Congress and President to come up with a big infrastructure plan. But with respect to public-private partnerships, which is something the President talks about, I think there are a couple opportunities. The one I've been focusing on is hydropower, not really a San Diego thing, except that I know San Vicente Dam has got a pump storage plant, which is great. I found out that in many cases, for the large hydropower projects, hydropower, base load energy, you don't have to worry about intermittent wind or sun. It basically totally clean. That it sometimes takes 10 years to get a permit. So I heard this, I whipped my head around to the Democratic staff line. I said, what are we doing? I mean, if you're not promoting hydropower, that power is going to be supplied by something we don't like even coal. And so I've been working on hydropower permitting. I'd like to see us take existing dams, retrofit them with good technology, by the way, that protects aquatic life and generates a lot of power. I think there's a theoretical hope that a lot of dams will be taken out. I think that's impractical. I also think that in the face of an existential crisis like climate change, we ought to be getting about the business of installing clean energy. And so I'm working on some of those permitting issues. But I'd be happy to hear, I guess finally I would say that I do brag on the city of San Diego sometimes about what we're doing on smart cities, how our utility is the most effective at doing renewable energy. And to the extent I can be helpful, I'm always willing to take your phone calls.
Thanks. I'll stand up here. I'll tell you, Congressman, that we actually related the zombie apocalypse to destruction of dams earlier. So you missed that, but you tied it together really well, so thank you for that. It kind of came full circle there. That's what happens in these types of gatherings. So I want to open it up to the audience, but while you think about your questions, and just raise your hand and we'll come find you. Let's talk a little bit about, we talked a lot about kind of how the water nexus overlaps, but from a utility perspective, maybe Scott and Jeff can touch on this a little bit. Similarities and differences in the two industries. What a lot of things that Clean Tech San Diego members are seeing is they've applied their technology in the energy space. They're now really interested in applying that same type of technology in the water space. And I think there's a lot of opportunity locally for that. So maybe each of you could just touch a little bit on kind of the similarities and differences in the two industries, and how the applicability of technology from one to the other, makes sense and what the opportunities are moving forward.
That's a hell of a jacket.
Yeah, I was going to say. You got the memo.
You didn't hit the softball.
All right. So we obviously have this huge amount of data, and we've always sort of wrestled with how best to use it. I find that our data is going to be really more powerful probably at the user side. So we're at the wholesale level and at the retail level, really getting into how individual consumers are making choices, because we have to deal with that whole peak issue that we talked about earlier. Big, huge surges in the morning, big, huge surges in the summertime. We build a treatment plant that can deliver up to, we average about 2 billion gallons of water a day service for drinking. But in summer, that can be about 6 billion gallons in a day, and in winter it can be like less than 1 billion. And so we have these incredible high swings, and you have to build everything for that high swing. It's almost like the tea kettle time in England, or Friday night in Jerusalem, where everyone takes all the water they can and then shuts down for 24 hours. So we have to build around these and try to smooth that out. And that's something we're wrestling with. But how do we do that to make our investments go longer? Otherwise, we are locked into the $2 trillion investment in water that's coming over the next decade.
Well, it's actually really scary, kind of the parallels between the energy and water utility sectors. One, we're really capital-intensive industries. long lead times with real big, gigantic infrastructure investments that we have to make in order for the systems to actually work. It can be really, really expensive. I would say the second area is intense stakeholder participation in everything that we do. So from the consumer to environmental groups to a legislator, whether it's federal or state, a host of regulators, it's very difficult to be able to build anything because there is such huge participation, which is good. We want to make sure that we're making the right investments, the right time, the right locations. But these are complicated projects that we have to generally get across the finish line. And I've worked in the energy industry for 15 years now. Prior to that, I worked as a legislative staffer. And I didn't think that anything could be more politically intense than energy until I sit next to the Met and deal with water, because we're just both, these are just two industries that has just such intense participation. And then finally, in terms of data is, at SDG&E we've had smart meters installed for about 10 years now. So we were one of the first utilities in the country to do it. And it's really providing that granularity both to us as operators and to our customers to help really drive conservation, to drive efficiency. Data is actually, it truly is revolutionizing how we manage the grid on a day-to-day basis. Now we're starting to shift our residential consumers to time of use rates. And then we'll be able to send pricing signals that when energy is less abundant or less clean, as it is from 4 p.m. to 9 p.m. at night now here in California, that we're going to send a price signal that the price of energy is going to be higher. But we need to be able to provide consumers with that information so they can make informed decisions about their energy use. And now we see the water industry and the water utilities really start to move even more so in that direction as well by the installation of smart meters and being able to provide that same level of granularity to consumers as well. So huge amount of perils.
And Philip, is that smart meter that's in the homes kind of monitoring that water usage and the utility usage, electricity usage, what do you see as the future and how kind of the consumer plays a role in this, just based on the data that they're getting from either their electric or water provider?
Well, sure. First of all, on the electric side, many studies have been done that with improved data visibility, that 5 to 10% of energy saving can be achieved kind of behaviorally, 10 to 15% through the installation of some minor automation, and then with direct load control programs like thermostat programs in the 15% and above range of energy that can be saved. On the water side, smart metering really is going after largely this number that you've heard a couple times now, 10 to 40% of water that's lost in the distribution system, either in front of or behind the meter, that with better information that water usage and where waste is occurring can be pinpointed much more accurately. So just going after really that visibility and being able to track down where loss occurs, I think is really the first step. Whether or not we'll get to time of use water rates at some point in the future, I think is kind of a difficult topic, because as Dr. Weber put up on the slide, water is life, and we're very careful about the notion of restricting this absolutely fundamental and critical asset of water.
Dr. Weber, anything to add to that?
I think great comment. So there's a lot said. When it comes about data, I do think data is useful for people to change their behavior, but I want to use a personal example that shows that how sometimes data is not enough. So I really like Dr. Pepper. Unfortunately, it's really bad for me. And on the label, it tells me exactly how bad for me it is. And I drink it anyway. And so information is a start, but it's not enough. You have to add information, plus these other things, automation, price signals are very important. If Dr. Pepper were really expensive, and if Dr. Pepper became more expensive the heavier I got, then I think I would change my behavior. And then maybe I'd have a smaller portion, that kind of thing. So I think we need time of use pricing and obesity pricing perhaps. But we need price signals as well as automation controls. Data is a key step. You can't do it without the data, but it's not enough. And it's the same with fuel economy stickers on cars. We have fuel economy stickers on cars that tell us their gasoline usage per mile and that kind of thing. And we've had them for decades, and they really only were useful when oil prices spiked in 2014 and 2008. So you had to have the information, and then people could buy a Toyota Prius instead of a Ford F-150, which is what they did when gasoline hit $4 a gallon. but they didn't do that until the price signal was there along with the data. So data's key, we gotta have it. I consider data one of the other infrastructures we have to invest in because it enables all these other benefits. But we have to think about these other market and behavioral and policy layers as well.
In the audience, start thinking of questions. 1 second, because I've got one now. David is the chief architect behind the City of San Diego's Smart Cities Plan, and someone who sits on a significant amount of data on a daily basis. How are you thinking about these issues as you move the city forward in its smart cities efforts and what you're doing with data, and also kind of the energy and water consumption of the city as a whole?
Well, I think that tied to that is also this whole question and comment about communications networks. I mean, think about this for a second. If the public, you really thought for a moment that on your water bill, on your energy bill, on your cell phone bill, on your cable bill, and on your taxes, you're paying for 5 different communications networks, like, we'd be shocked, right? I mean, think about this for a second. Like, we're paying over and over and over to move information, control, and move data. And so I think Philip's comment is so absolutely crucial to say, yes, it's important to begin to look for those intersections between, the city's water system that we run, the utility, critical infrastructure protection. I mean, we have requirements around homeland security and cameras and critical infrastructure protection. How are we then tying that into a bigger and broader network that then makes sense for the entire city, that can not just do the single mission of security for our water infrastructure, but also information connected with streetlights for parking and transportation and all sorts of other things. All that comes down to the fact that the more open you can be with that data, and we have a great open data portal, our default really is to open, the more you can begin to have those intersections of that data, make it available to the public and your partners, the more you understand what your partners need from that data and can share that. That is where we begin to get at the fact that, yes, we all may have different communications infrastructures. Yes, we may want to try to share those, but there's challenges. But it's ultimately that output of the data and through an open data portal, how you can do that. I think a great example of this in real life impacts to us is that SDG&E has meteorologists, like weathermen and women. I never would have thought that you guys would have that at a utility. Well, why? Well, because of the 03 and 07 wildfires, right? They need to be able to protect the system, reduce their liability, and making sure that they're not starting fires in the backcountry, right? That can be extremely expensive for the utility. But then take the idea that you have that, you now have visualized that, you put it out on the web. We've now partnered with CAL FIRE, with the city firefighting department, to use that exact data to do predictive deployments of our fire trucks and fire resources so that we're knocking down fires. And we have not seen anywhere close to the level of wildfires that we've had. We're knocking them down quicker than we ever have before. Why? Because shared data between agencies. And so that is crucial to the smart city of beginning to think not just what I need and what I'm generating, but what are other people generating and what are their needs. How do we then push that out in an open platform? And then how does that end up really impacting and changing people's lives?
Excellent. Heather, you had a question?
Sure. So this is for everybody, but I want to start with Dr. Weber and go this way because I'm going to make the utility guy go last. So piggybacking on Jason's conversation, because, well, Scott, I want you to then say where the federal government could actually play in this. So piggyback on this idea of what the utilities, we've done a lot in terms of distributed energy resources. That's both distributed generation and efficiency writ large. In the same way, if you could get creative, what would a distributed water grid look like that runs both ways as opposed to one direction in water, similar to what we do now with electricity?
Great question. Question is, can we do a distributed water grid? And the answer is yes. Could we make it a two-way distributed water grid? That's harder, but let me give a couple comments. A distributed water grid system might look like an on-site water harvesting system. You do rainwater harvesting. You can do things on site, like take water from your shower while you're looking to warm up and use that water to water your flower bed. That's called showers to flowers. That's a great water use. You can do things like that. We take the
better than toilet to tap.
It's better than toilet to tap. We can take gray water and flush our toilets with it. It's kind of weird that we use the world's cleanest, most incredible drinking water to flush our toilets, although that's not happening here. There's so much conservation use in San Diego. It's great. So ladies, I'm gonna let you know a secret, you won't know, in the men's room, there's a urinal with a sign right in front of you, and some of the men have gone back and seen this, that says, this toilet is flushed with, indirect, whatever, water reuse. It's not drinking water, it's flushing the toilet. It's treated effluent. And I think that's brilliant and a great sign for San Diego. What makes me scared for San Diego is below it says, do not drink. You have to tell your citizens not to drink the urinal water, you're in for a lot of trouble. So, there's hope, but so I think using non-drinking water, flush your toilets, using that water for your flower beds, doing water harvest, that kind of distributed water system is very, it can be done with technology. Having it go two ways is a little harder because you don't want to mix different types of water systems. The way, like power, you might mix your solar power with your coal power, that's fine, you can mix power, it's harder to mix water and a lot of risk. So I'm not sure we'll get there very easily, I'm not sure we need to in honesty, but the distributed on-site capabilities are quite good. And I think that's a real opportunity. We could get to on-site treatment at some point, that's harder. They do it in some places, at the space station they do it. Now it's because of the weight of the water that Jeff mentioned earlier. Water is 8 pounds per gallon. The lift cost for NASA is something like $50,000 per pound or something. I don't know what the lift costs are for NASA. But to get fresh water at the space station is very heavy and very expensive. So they do on-site treatment. They take the urine and the water from hand washing and the sweat. They treat it on-site and drink it on the space station for astronauts. They do direct potable reuse because it's so much cheaper to do that in all honesty than the other options. Singapore does direct potable reuse for new water, we call it pure water here, but new water in Singapore for 20%. We're not there for our homes where we can do direct potable reuse in our homes. That is so much more energy intensive. You get better economies of scale at the centralized facility. But for the non-potable applications, lots of opportunity. And a lot of it's a code issue, a permitting issue, an R&D issue, a lot of opportunities for federal government to step in or other layers of government. Great question.
Thanks for the question again. I would say, this is my own personal view. I'm an information technology guy, right? I'm not a water expert, but I do see evidence of things that are coming that I think are very cool. My son, for example, is 13 and he's heavily involved with aquaponics, right? So those are sort of, and Cisco does get involved in a lot of smart buildings, and if you look at some of the architectures, there's a lot of demands being placed on them around codes to state that they need to be able to do certain things. So, collecting that water, recycling that water, being able to use all kinds of different systems around the endpoint, right? So even at my own house, right, I'm doing an addition to my house and I'm trying to figure out where to put a gray water system. I never would have thought of that 5 years ago, right? But your washer, your dryer, your showers, your washer and your showers are, massive consumption of water, and you just put it into the sewer system. It's almost criminal, right? You could water your lawn. You don't have to put the artificial lawn in, even though I probably will end up doing that. But no, I think, I see evidence of things that are very cool. And as a guy who's an avid mountain biker and backcountry person here in San Diego, some of you may or may not realize that the city is, or the water group is starting to put in new sewer systems through the canyons, right? Why are they doing that? Well, they're not going to have runoff in some of those cases. Instead of just water, where you see the little sign that says this goes out to the ocean, there's a little dolphin on it, some of that stuff is going away, right? I see that as evidence as a citizen, and I know why, because I go to the Citizens Advisory Council. That's an asset. They want that water back, right? I'm just not going to let it flow out to the ocean, which does great things. But at the same time, that's evidence that I see. And obviously all the technology that goes with that we can all imagine. But the cool thing is I see evidence of these changes. So that's my comment.
I mean, this I think is very simple. The whole justification for the Pure Water program was that the cost of imported water was continuing to rise, and at some point the intersection between generating it from wastewater and what we were going to be paying anyway led us to saying we're going to spend $2 billion to do this. It's all about the price indicators, right? So it probably doesn't make a whole lot of sense, as Dr. Weber said, to have kind of closed home systems of treating wastewater. Yes, there's simpler ways with gray water and recycled water, but just think about what we've seen with the solar panel revolution, right? The ability to come off the grid because of the increasing price of electricity ends up leading to people making capital investments that end up reducing their energy utilization. The exact same thing goes for water. And as a system, as a city, and as a system of water, I don't think you really need to get to the distributed water system because we can begin to utilize the system and network that it has today, bring in energy resources to reduce the overall energy import or electricity that we're using off the grid, and use that as a way, as a collective system, to end up having the real impact of achieving the goals of a distributed water system in a different way.
So last comment on we do a fair amount of distributed water microgrids in wetter parts of the world. in Southern California, incredible challenge. Southern California has the most volatile weather in California, which has the most volatile weather in the United States. We go, you know, if you lived here this last decade, we have had 8 years with virtually no rain down here and 2 pretty wet years. So you're not gonna, if you're gonna build a system that's all built around the natural systems, local, it's not gonna function 8 out of 10 years. So you're gonna have to find ways to supplement it and match it with other resources, whether it's desalination or imported water. And primarily our use in this state, because we are a relatively water-rich state, we just have water in a very different place than where we have most of the people. We've chosen importing because it's about, you know, ocean desal is about 2.5 times more expensive than importing water. So it's a very expensive choice. It's a very energy-intensive choice. It is a choice. Other parts of the world do it much more heavily. But the grid system to interlock everything locally is going to be a small part of our future because we just don't have enough natural water here, and climate change is coming at us like a freight train, and except slowly. So there is time to get out of the way, but it is coming, and we're just drying up faster and faster. And interestingly, the models show Northern California is going to stay wet, but rain, not snow. And Southern California is just going to continue to get drier. And so the opportunities down here for using local solutions are just going to get tougher.
Scott, any comments from your
Well,
perspective?
I think that's right. The issue last time we looked at this was that we didn't give permission for local water, distributed water systems. So we had to get permission to have showers to flowers. And you know, the state health department was very squeamish about that. I'm not sure that they've adjusted that or not. It sounds like they might have. But really, I mean, people want to have rain barrels and double plumb their house for showers to flowers. We should give them permission to do that. But I don't think we're going to ever have the price signals that are sent that suggest that that's going to be a normal thing to do. I think the centralized system is going to be more appealing on water than the distributed. I also think, you know, in the face of these incredibly high housing prices, which are such a challenge for everyone from businesses who are recruiting down to homeless people, it's tough to require double plumbing in a house. It's tough to justify that. Doesn't make any sense.
So speaking of high cost of housing and those types of kind of equity issues, David, from your perspective, and maybe if anyone else wants to chime in on this, as we talk about the deployment of smart technologies, whether they be on the water utility or the electric utility side, you know, what's the benefit and how are those impacting kind of our most disadvantaged community members in San Diego, and what are we doing to think about that? You know, we can all sit in this room and talk about the deployment of technology, but there's a lot of us that can't afford those technologies, don't know how we're going to use those technologies, and so how should we start thinking about the equity issue as it relates to the deployment of these types of technologies?
I think that's a great question, and I'll start by saying, you know, in general, the delivery of services by government is grossly inefficient. Okay, I should not probably say that since I'm coming from your local government, but it just is. Why? Because we have legacy systems, right? It's not like we're starting this architecture from scratch today with all the technology. We've been in existence, you know, as a city for 200 years, approximately, a little less than 200 years. So when we think about those questions of all those legacy issues and systems and the opportunities technology provides us, you know, San Diego has used technology and smart city technology to solve problems and solve challenges. We didn't build some smart city plan. What have we decided to do this year? Well, we're actually deciding that based upon all these projects, there's enough learning that's happened. We've seen savings and efficiencies and added operational controls that we want to actually create our first smart cities plan. But different than what anybody has ever done, we're going to take an inclusive approach and start with the underserved neighborhoods first. How can smart technology, whether it's energy, water, lighting, etc., how can that impact a neighborhood and those investments? What do they need? And then build an entire strategy for the entire city based upon the input coming from those neighborhoods. Why does this matter? Because those are the places that can have, I think, the greatest impact. Those are the places that underreport the most. Those are those that are most disaffected. And those are the places that need the greatest amount of investment. And if you can do it right there, then you can do it right throughout the entire city. And Clean Tech is going to be our lead on pulling together the folks to do exactly this, and say that informed from those underserved neighborhoods, we'll have an inclusive approach to what that smart city is. And I think that in and of itself is going to necessitate discussions about energy and water, efficiency, utilization, public safety, communications networks. That is going to be very exciting, and we look forward to a lot of input from all of you as we go down this journey this particular year.
Question over here.
Oh, yeah, Dan McMillan with Helix Water. I was just wondering what gas and electric and Icon's ideas are for integrating the data collection with water meters and gas. Since San Diego Gas already has it, but if we at Helix put it in, we have this whole system we have to develop.
Yeah, for our thought about the fact that we run our business as electricity, gas, and water is to share our R&D and infrastructure within our company across all three commodities, and now expanding out to street lighting and all kinds of other smart city opportunities. And of course, we want to facilitate and enable and encourage that with our utility customers, that this infrastructure that's being put out into the field, that once you're 18 feet off the ground and able to collect all this information, that we make it absolutely as easy as possible to put other devices under the network. This isn't about technology. This is a business model and regulatory challenge to figure out the mechanism of how best to do this. It's certainly our job to make sure that it is easy and cost effective to put new water endpoints under the network. And I'll pass the mic now to the local utility who's working on making this happen.
It's a real good question. So again, we've had our smart meter network and the communications network now for 10 years. So, the thing that we're focused on right now is exactly what you asked about. So we actually have a pilot with the Rainbow Water District right now to evaluate and actually have we modules installed and then use our communications network to actually collect the data, transmit the data back to Rainbow. So, we really see this as a big opportunity. Again, we have probably more bandwidth than what we're utilizing for our own smart meter network, especially as we start moving from 4G to 3G to 4G right now, and then soon to 5G. And so this is a model that we're looking at. So, and it's not just water agencies, but what other types of devices could we actually connect to our system? So this is something that we're actively pursuing. And again, with partnership with the pilot with Rainbow, we'll see how this goes, and hopefully, I have no doubt it's going to be successful, and then we'll be able to potentially roll this out to other partners.
And let me mention from the water utility side, so the benefits to customers and to the organization itself is huge. Some of you have heard about in the news about misread bills and incorrect bills. That's 343 bills for our public utilities department out of 250,000 users on the system, 343, and it's making splashes in headlines, and the COO has to go out in the public, etc. None of that would have happened with advanced metering infrastructure. And though we do have 30% of our customers right now on advanced metering, and we're moving forward with rapid deployment for the rest, that's the kind of the intangible that you wouldn't necessarily think about, that yes, there's all these benefits to the system, but there's also benefits to the public ultimately in avoiding those big catastrophes.
Rick?
Yeah, Rick Hazer with Black and Beach. I'm really excited about the prospect of that pump storage project up at San Vicente Dam. I'm just curious, Jeff, maybe you could address this. Are there other places in the state where similar geographies and capabilities exist where we could have these massive storage projects?
Yeah, so we have a fair amount of pump storage throughout the state, particularly over on the larger facilities. You see them at Lake Oroville Dam, you see them also at San Luis Reservoir. Wherever you have a large facility, the pump storage works really well. Metropolitan has 17 hydroelectric plants in our system, generating anywhere from 35 to 75 megawatts a day, just capturing wherever you've got a good enough fall. The fascinating one that's on the books right now, because of this huge glut of solar power, they're actually talking about doing one at Lake Mead, which would It's a huge lift. So moving the water up and down through Hoover Dam, and LADWP and a number of utilities are costing that out and seeing if they can use that to basically bank their solar power. But most of the ones that are cost effective today have been built, and it's going to take either a bigger shift in between the peaks and valleys of the costing to see if some of these, because they're pretty expensive, or they'll be driven by this flood of power that has to be banked somewhere, and water is a way of sort of banking power.
Nicola.
Hi, Nicola Hedge with the San Diego Foundation. I was curious, you touched on it a little bit with the question of Ikea, but as conservation is such a big pillar for both the water and energy sector, you mentioned some of the ways that those programs are integrated through things like dishwashers, which use water and a lot of energy. It strikes me that there's still a lot of opportunity to better align funding streams where we're doing programs with customers, businesses, residents. We funded a home energy coach program at the foundation that became a home energy and water coach program. Are there other ways or obstacles where some of the technology or collaboration or policy could help overcome some of those obstacles and turn them into opportunities for our region to do a lot of those things more smartly together?
Exactly. It's a real good question. Again, and it takes partnership, right? First of all, so we're again very fortunate to have had a very long history and a great partnership with the San Diego County Water Authority. So that's kind of where we've started historically in terms of doing exactly what you said. Is we focus a lot on joint promotion, number one. So both us and Water Authority have outreach teams, and so we actually utilize and actually have joint collateral materials and other education to actually talk about this energy and water nexus, number one. Number two, I think where we're trying to go to is how can we have more one-stop shops for, if a customer calls us and says, and maybe a multifamily building might be the best example, is not to have to come to us on lighting and other energy efficiencies and maybe go somewhere else for water, faucets or low flow toilets. Is we're trying to look at how can we have this kind of one-stop shop for efficiency and not really have this huge dividing line between energy and water. And I think we've had some success in the past, but quite frankly, there's always more that we can do. And the same thing with kind of the rebates and incentives. So how can we make it easier on customers to understand what rebates are available, what incentives that we can give them to take action both on the energy and water side, and have the rebate process or the incentive process be again a little bit more one-stop shop-ish, if you can. Now, granted, we all have different regulators and bodies that we have to work through, but there are formal proceedings at the California Public Utilities Commission on this exact topic. So our regulators are encouraging us to do exactly that. And let me just give you maybe just one example is at Balboa Park, we actually partnered with the Water Authority on the installation of a bunch of water-saving devices throughout the park, and that saves energy, so we can actually apply some of our energy efficiency savings to that as well. So that's just one example. We're trying to move that way, but there's obviously still a lot more opportunity. And maybe we can talk as well. I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Bill.
Congressman, I'd like to hear the energy solutions with the dams coming up. I think that's fantastic, but I think one of the untapped resources we have here, especially in California, and to expand along the western coast of our great nation, is the wave energy conversion. I think it's untapped. We had a farm not really come to completion up in Oregon, but Scotland is at the forefront of this. And I think this is something that we could really expand into. And unlike solar, it's 24 hours a day. Is there anything on the books or something maybe I don't know about going ahead of these countries?
It's a great point, and to be honest with you, I haven't heard that kind of discussion at the Energy Subcommittee. And I will tell you,
I'd be happy to have it.
Yeah, we love. No. The other thing I'm just observing here is that there's a saying necessity is the mother of invention, and because of our situation with water, and because we have these governors, each governor is trying to up the last one on renewables. A lot of amazing stuff is coming out of California, and so I do take those ideas back. And I'm gonna let's catch up take Howard's card at the end and we'll talk about that technology.
I've got a couple comments on wave energy, just from a technical perspective. The resource is huge. It's not going to run out. It's sustainable, but it's tricky for places like California that make a lot of money off their coast for other purposes like tourism. In a place like Scotland, where they don't make as money from the coast for those reasons, where they have a lot bigger waves, it's more practical. And so what we find with wave energy, and it sounds like you're deeply involved with this, so I might not be saying things you like, but there are other options onshore that are cheaper and easier. And so I think that's what becomes a problem with wave energy, is it's more costly, and then you're dealing with offshore hostile corrosive environments, salt water. So it just ends up getting expensive. That doesn't mean we shouldn't explore it. I think the best federal policy lever there is through a pretty robust R&D program called Drive Down the Cost, that we all benefit from that. But I think if you start laying wave energy along the coast and starts competing with natural ecosystems, tourism, fishing, other things, you get more stakeholders lined up against you. I think that's been a challenge for wave energy. And then there are a lot of places in the United States, like the Gulf of Mexico, where the waves are horrible. And so it doesn't work for every coast, it only works for certain types of coast. But in a place like Scotland with big waves and not as many stakeholders that use the coast for other purposes, and they've got fewer onshore options, it makes a lot of sense. So sorry to be the downer on that one.
That's a great point. Thank you. I have a solution for all.
And that's why we have innovators in the room.
Thank you. Al Sweetler, SDSU. I'd like to bring in an international dimension here. We have a population right across the border, similar, which will even be larger than we have in San Diego Imperial counties. They're actually critical water and energy needs. We've been sharing energy back and forth for decades. What do you think the possibility of beginning to think of water as a joint resource and thinking of cross-border transfers for water, both technically and politically?
I'd just like to comment on the politics right now, U.S.-Mexico relations.
I think that's all you have to say.
Water is a whole curve. Just honestly, I mean, we're sweating over NAFTA, the plug being pulled on NAFTA. I had all these business groups in briefing California Democrats on the importance of NAFTA. I think they're finally coming around. They understand it. We are talking about a border wall that is, both insulting and a waste of money and kind of racist probably. And if you look what happened with respect to the latest water flow issue we had across the border, I'm concerned that our relationships have been affected in a way that might be the reason they didn't give us a phone call and let us know this was happening, because it happened over a course of 3 or 4 days and they didn't let us know for some weeks after that. We have to, just from a political perspective, I can't answer the technical feasibility, but we have to be working together with these folks because it makes us stronger, obviously, but also if we don't, we're going to have these kinds of problems. So from an economic perspective, a cultural perspective, an environmental perspective, we are headed the wrong direction on U.S.-Mexico relationships. And by the way, there's a presidential election coming up in Mexico, and we're sending the wrong signals into that election. And we're going to get a guy, we've had the best relationships between our two countries for the last 25 years. Well, 25 years, and then the last one was different. But I'm very concerned about it. It's a good point you raise, Al. We got to turn that around.
And let me give you a little bit of good news on that front, which is rare in this panel. The Colorado River, we share it with 7 states, 2 countries, United States and Mexico, and 10 Indian tribes. And none of us got along. We usually just sued each other. But starting in 2000, the system went into drought, and it's been an unprecedented drought. It's been a non-stop drought for the last 18 years, and it's likely going to continue. And that led us to look for solutions to work with each other. For the first time, we entered into interstate banking arrangements. Instead of California and Arizona suing each other, we actually started banking each other's water. And then Mexico had an earthquake, and they couldn't take delivery of their water because most of their system was shattered. And we banked it for them in Lake Mead and said, we'll hold it for you. And they said, what we need is money, not the water right now. And we actually made an arrangement where Metropolitan provided, and so did Las Vegas and Phoenix, and we provided tens of millions of dollars so they rebuilt their system, and they paid us back with the water that we banked for them. And that was in a treaty amendment, we call it Minute 319. We then backed it up with another amendment to the treaty 323, where we're going to repeat that process and actually add system conservation in Mexico, and again, they're going to pay us back with water. And it's just a beginning, but we have started that process, and I find that one of the more encouraging bits of news that we've had on the Colorado River in this last 18 years of drought. We've actually necessity, mother of invention.
I want to make a comment on that if I could. You know, as a technology company, we get dragged into a lot of discussions about being the first and the fastest smart city in the U.S., right? And your comment kind of reminded me of this, right? Because we're becoming a much smaller world, right? In that, you know, you start thinking about, well, in the county of San Diego, there's how many cities? I don't know, 18, they're significant, right? But you've got smart city projects only happening in 1 or 2 or 3, right? So I think that, you know, as the comment was earlier, that, you know, that there are politics that are involved in some of these things, and some of those things are starting to fall away. As cities start to realize that, like, look, this is actually just a smart decision for all of us to get into a room. Why am I making one smart city plan when I should be making 18 at once? At the county level, right? And I think that that's actually starting to happen. I think the good signs that I see throughout all the different cities in the western U.S., which is where I'm at primarily, so Las Vegas, Phoenix, whatever, my projects have gone from city projects to county projects and sometimes going up to state projects, right? And when you look at the global situation, right, you look at like Singapore and Israel and other areas of the world, you've got one country managing water infrastructure for 3 countries, which is very interesting if you think about the Homeland Security sort of view of that, right? I've got my neighbor managing my water. Well, that's a little scary. But those things are starting to fall away, right? As people start to realize that, look, this is the efficient way to do it. We can handle this through agreements. We can actually get things done better by being more efficient. I know that, you know, David and I share some of the same issues with regards to the data silos that are out there and trying to pull things together to make decisions. But that really is where the answers to some of our questions lie, right? We've got to combine data. We've got to combine models. There's going to be losers and winners that are perceived in the beginning. Is the energy company going to lose revenue because people are putting solar panels up? Yes. But are automated vehicles and connected vehicles going to drive more demand than they've ever seen? Yes. Right? So I think we're just in the middle of this sort of transition, right? Where I would certainly expect that, you know, we're going to see energy companies and other types of models shift, right? Where they're going to be providing services in a much wider scale because of IoT and because of some of the technology. But, you know, all the different comments that folks have made today about, you know, some of the decision making at the consumer level is really critical. That's where data also comes in. If I can tell you tomorrow, if I can do predictive and prescriptive analytics and tell you that tomorrow you shouldn't use water between 9 and 11 because it'll cost you twice the price, you'd probably change your behavior, right? The issue is I tell you when it's happening. Hey, oh, by the way, your electricity rate is up. Well, it's not that useful. I'm not at home right now. What am I supposed to do? My sprinkler's on. I can't control that. Well, you could, right? But the point is that as we start to actually move information into the predictive and prescriptive model, and as you start to see more collaboration, that's where these efficiencies come in, right? And that's where we also see a lot of savings and opportunities. So.
And I would just mention that Robert there is prophetic because, in fact, when I talk about that inclusive smart city plan, one of the main things that we've discussed and our competitive advantages having Cleantech San Diego here is that be the start of a regional plan. So the City of San Diego, the Port, Chula Vista, and others under the Smart Cities Initiative now is looking at, let's take each of our plans and let's build this regional strategy. So I would expect to see that in 2019.
And I had a conversation to that end with the City Managers Association in San Diego just yesterday.
I've got a comment also because I always have a comment and it's just kind of want to hear my
Make it
voice.
good, it might be your last one.
Yeah. Okay. I think the comment's great. I think that if we look over history, over like 5,000 years of history, water is often a source of conflict, but water done the right way is a cause of peace, and so there's room for collaboration. And I want to talk a little bit about the wall and immigration pressures because a lot of the climate models suggest Mexico's going to get hit very hard by drought, and that will create more immigration pressure on the border. And I think if we really want to deal with immigration pressures, the wall will be expensive and effective. I share your sentiment on that. I think collaboration would have better effect on reducing immigration pressures by helping solve energy resources in Mexico than a physical barrier would. If we can look at examples around the world where a water resources are a local event, but they have global consequence, and energy resources are local, but have global consequence. If we look at what happened with Syria years ago with a major drought that bankrupted farmers, a lot of farmers were making like 35% unemployment or something like that. So they moved into cities, and you add a lot of unemployed people to cities, combined with oppressive governance, you get a really tough situation in Syria, which creates a global immigration crisis, especially into Europe, which leads to toppled governments in the United States and Brexit. These votes are tied to immigration crises, and the immigration crisis is tied to a drought in Syria. So this one drought in one location in farms creates a city pressure, which creates an immigration pressure, which changes the votes and major outcomes with global consequence. I think the same kind of thing could happen in Mexico. We should be thoughtful partners for this because the immigration pressure will only get worse because as resources deplete in Mexico and water resources are less available, there'll be more northward pressure, and if we collaborate in a thoughtful way, we can help solve that, reduces the pressure, it's cheaper, and we get a lot of economic benefit out of it. So I think there is a room for multinational cooperation and collaboration. Thank you.
This is a good last. Okay. Josh, you have a question.